Hey there, welcome back. My name's Terry and I'm the Shieldmaiden in the kitchen. So if you watched my previous video where I was making some croutons out of an old loaf of sourdough bread that I had that needed to be used up, I mentioned in there that I'd become quite the COVID baker. I've been experimenting both with sourdough and with yeasted types of bread, and I have a pretty good list of various formulations from naan to English muffins to sandwich loaves to country loaves and others besides. But today what I'm going to do is show you how to use the sourdough in order to make bagels. This is my sourdough starter and its name is Seymour. Some of you may know, if you have sourdough starters sitting on your counter, that it is a living thing. And so I was instructed by the person whose recipe that I followed to make this sourdough starter that because it's a living thing, you sort of keep it like a pet. And that means it should be named. It's kind of a weird idea, but I'm kind of into that. So it's Seymour, and probably some of you might recognize what the reference is to Seymour when something needs to be fed.
Feed me Seymour.
But so bagels are something that come from actually the Jewish community in Poland. There are medieval references to bagels or a particular type of bread product that is in the form of a round ball with a hole in the middle, but I'm sure it probably predates that. Vikings, on the other hand, probably did not eat bagels and probably didn't have access to them, although they did travel pretty far and wide, but we just don't have any written evidence about a connection between Vikings and bagels. So that's about as much as I'm going to be able to say about that. But I do want to, as a professional historian, because I understand the importance of citing one's sources, I do want to let you know that what I'm going to do with this bagel recipe is a combination of a couple different recipes that I found online, a couple of pretty good sourdough blogs. One is called The Clever Carrot and the other is called Little Spoon Farms. So I will put links to those in the description as well. They've got some great recipes that you can follow. But like I mentioned before, I'm someone who kind of likes to tinker with people's recipes. And so I've taken information from both of those sites and I'll put it together and kind of do my own thing. That tends to be my style. Also, just an extra shout out to The Clever Carrot. It's her starter recipe that I use in order to come up with this, and it's so super simple because basically it's just flour and water, and the initial mix of the starter happens over the period of about 7 days, and then after that point it's usable, and then you just keep it alive. I have a friend in Iceland, Hal, who tells me that his sourdough starter has been going since the 1970s, so that's pretty amazing. All right, so we'll get started by mixing together the ingredients and getting ready to prove overnight. To begin the mix, we've got a stand mixer that I generally use, although this doesn't require a stand mixer for this. You can mix just in a regular mixing bowl. And the first mix is just simply whisking some ingredients together with a fork. But then as you add the flour, of course, it will begin to become a stiffer mix. And so if you want to get a good hand workout, you can do the mixing and then some of the kneading at first, just by hand. Or you can do it with the stand-up mixer and using the dough hook, which is what I'm going to do today. So the first ingredients that we mix together is a little over a cup, about 1 cup and a couple of teaspoons of warm water. Or if you're doing the metric version, it's about 250 grams of water. So we'll put the warm water in there, and then into that we mix 3/4 of a cup of our sourdough starter. So I'm just going to pour it out. Watch. And of course, now we're going to need to feed Seymour again so we can replenish and have some starter for the next recipe. And I'll mix that starter right in with the water. It always smells so good. It's got this kind of interesting pungent smell that is kind of pleasing, I think. So we have a mixture of the water and the sourdough starter, and then to that we're going to add a couple of tablespoons of sugar, just plain white sugar. So 2 tablespoons there. And then we mix that just with a fork, just to kind of get it all into a nice liquid. Keep mixing it around, almost like you're using a whisk. You could even actually use a wire whisk to just get that really well combined. Okay, once that's combined, then you can add the dry ingredients, which is 4 cups or just over 4 cups if you're using US measurements. So 4 cups and a couple tablespoons really. And then that will, bread flour, and then that will be also including a little bit of salt as well. So we've got my salt over here. And again, I'm using kosher salt. You can also use just regular table salt with this particular recipe. We'll need 1.5 teaspoons of salt. So I'll throw that in. I've got a 1/2 teaspoon measure here. So 1, 2, 3. And then into that, again, we'll have 4 cups, just over 4 cups of bread flour. Now, bread flour in Europe is something that is usually referred to as strong flour. So here in the United States, we have regular, what is called all-purpose flour, which is different. This is bread flour, so you'll actually want to look for flour that says that on the package, that it's specifically for bread, because the gluten content is different. There's a higher gluten content in bread flour. So we use a specific type of flour for this. So I'm going to mix in the 4 cups. And because today I'm making cinnamon-raisin bagels, I'm going to need to put in some cinnamon. If you were just making a regular bagel, like an everything bagel, or even just a plain bagel, or maybe a sesame bagel, then this is the point at which you would stop and you begin to mix together your dough. But I'm going to add this one final ingredient of probably a couple tablespoons of cinnamon. I've found that the recipes that I was originally going after or following online didn't have quite as much cinnamon to my taste that I liked, so I just kind of eyeball it and add in quite a bit. So I'm going to grab some cinnamon here. I don't even really measure it. I just, again, I kind of throw a bunch in until it looks good, and then, ooh, I need to get more cinnamon already. And I'm gonna kind of mix that into the flour a little bit, right on top of the liquid measure. And then just stir up. You could put the paddle on your mixer at this point if you don't want to use the fork. But I think the fork is also, you know, a pretty easy way to mix it. It doesn't take long though for you to start to see that it is a very stiff dough, and if you've ever eaten bagels, you know they are a really dense and chewy type of bread product, so it just makes sense that there's quite a bit of density and stiffness to this particular dough. When it gets mostly combined, it looks kind of shaggy. Give you a look of that. Kind of crumbly, kind of shaggy. That's fine. You can just tell it's fairly combined, even down to the bottom of the bowl. So remove the fork, and it's at this point that you can put your dough hook on and stick that down in there. And you'll want to mix it on the dough hook on low for about 5 to 6 minutes until everything just kind of begins to come together. So I'll do that right now and we'll come back when it's finished. That's been mixing now with the dough hook for about just 2 or 3 minutes. We're about halfway through, but you can already see how it's beginning to come together. But because it's so stiff, you can see that the mixer is really kind of trying to have to work hard at getting that mix together. While that's mixing, I'm going to feed Seymour. And with Seymour, we have regular all-purpose flour. So I use organic all-purpose flour because, of course, nothing's too good for Seymour. Simply, all we have to do is put in 1/2 cup of the flour. I do this in 2 different 1/4 cup measures. And then one of these, 1/4 cup of warm water. Here for some warm water. Alright, so there's my warm water. And then just mix thoroughly with the fork into the sourdough starter that's still in the bottom of the jar. Get that mixed up really well so that it sort of resembles the consistency of like pancake or waffle batter. And once that's mixed up well, then we just wipe off the rim of the jar, keep that nice and clean, and seal it back up. And Seymour then is ready to go back in his little place on the counter. I don't know why I called it his little place. I think Seymour maybe is his male name. I'm not sure. And by tomorrow, we'll have more sourdough ready to make a new recipe. Just 1 more minute or so to go with the dough. Okay, so that was about 5 minutes. I'm going to remove the hook. And you can see here, that is a pretty good dense dough. Some of it caught here a little bit in the bottom of the bowl, but that's okay. Kind of scrape it out with my fingernails. And then we're just going to let it sit so that it can begin to proof a bit for about an hour. And we'll want to cover it with a damp towel while that's happening. And it can just sit at room temperature here. Doesn't need to be in like a warmed oven or anything like that. So you get the towel, squeeze it out. Good, nice damp towel. And there we are. So it's the first resting period. And again, that will be for about an hour. So we'll come back after that and prepare it in the final step before it does its rest for overnight. Our dough's been sitting for about an hour in the initial rest, and now it's time to knead in the raisins and then prepare it to have a longer rest for overnight. And remove the towel, and then let's take the dough out of the bowl that we used the stand-in mixer with the stand-in mixer, and we're going to transfer it to a new fresh clean bowl that will be lightly oiled with a light type of oil such as a canola or sunflower or safflower oil or plain vegetable oil. Put that over there. This is our dough that is very pliable. It's very soft feeling, even though it is a stiff and very dense dough. We don't really need to knead it per se, and as you can see, I don't even have a floured surface here. We don't need to have that. It's not really going to stick on anything. It has a nice smooth surface to it, not sticky at all. You see it's not getting on my hands or anything, but you do want to go ahead and just kind of form it into a rough, flat piece. That, I mean, it's a little bit difficult to do again because of the density of it, but it kind of pulls and you can be even a little bit rough with it. And you just get it into maybe a kind of a rectangular shape of some kind, or even, you know, maybe a little bit of a circle or an oval, pulling it out a little bit just so we can lay some of the raisins flat on the surface and then begin to knead them and press them into the dough. That's pretty good. These are just plain old garden variety, you know, California raisins. And I just put some on here, and because again the fact that the dough isn't really sticky or moist, you kind of have to work a little bit to press them in and get them to stick in there. And what I've found is the best thing to do is to stick some on like this. I don't know, what do we have here, maybe 1/3 of a cup or something like that. Kind of distribute them evenly. And then when you feel like you've gotten those pressed in pretty well, then you can fold the dough. And I fold it a couple different ways, sometimes like a book fold, sometimes just over once in half. It just depends. You just kind of work with it and do whatever you feel works for you. And then we'll put some more raisins on the next layer here. And while I'm doing that, because I'm usually going to give you a little bit of history, I do want to talk a little bit about the history of sourdough. Some of you, especially if you're sourdough enthusiasts, probably know this, but in case you're not, sourdough is literally like the oldest leavening agent for bread that's known to humankind. It is the leavening agent or the rising agent for bread that has been used the longest. As a matter of fact, the types of wheat that we, or sorry, not wheat, but yeast that we use in baking now, that comes in little packets, or even if you buy it in bulk, that baker's yeast has only really been in use for less than 200 years. So it really is a modern development. Prior to that, it was all sourdough, which is natural leavening based on using the grains of the flour and then the natural yeast that is just in the air. It's something that for sure is one of those kind of happy accidents of history. Like a lot of things with cooking, like I mentioned, even when we were making the skyr, the rennet that is used in modern skyr is something that was discovered probably by accident. It's believed that some goat or sheep herder put some milk inside a sheep stomach or intestine, you know, like you use for sausage casings and so forth. That's oftentimes has been in the past used for putting milk or other products, meat products in, and somebody put some milk products and then realized that it started to curdle, and the curds in the whey started to separate, and so there was a natural enzyme that was in the intestine of the animal. And of course we know now that that actually is what makes rennet. We also don't specifically know, and I have a good conversation about this going with my Icelandic friend Sig, about what the history of rennet and the use of something like it in the Viking Age was. We're digging into that, and we'll definitely find out and get back to you. But sourdough is sort of the similar kind of story. It's a story of, you know, an accidental culinary effect happening that people then noticed, and noticed that it made a nice tasting bread and a bread that would rise higher and that was lighter than the traditional flatbreads that many, many cultures have in the world. The first recorded use of sourdough actually comes out of ancient Egypt, so this is a long, long time ago, literally thousands of years ago. So it is a very, very old human thing. When you have all of your raisins that you want incorporated into the dough, then again, kind of form it into a nice bowl that we will be transferring into, or a nice ball shape, I should say, that we will be transferring into our bowl. I'm just going to use some plain canola oil here to do a light oiling. One of the things about having this first rest and rise for an hour is it gave me time to go running. Those of you who know me know I'm a long-time runner, and so these are nice opportunities when you're making some of these recipes to sort of take a window of time and go out and enjoy the out of doors and get in some exercise. Plus, I have a half marathon coming in October, and so that's like breathing down my neck. Got to get the miles in. All right, there we have our ball of dough just resting nicely in this bowl. We won't see a huge rise on this like you normally would with a yeasted bread, a more traditional baker's yeast, like a modern yeast. We'll see what happens in the morning. I have had, different levels of success in rising based on the sourdough starter. It's like sometimes I'll use sourdough starter that is not quite as fresh as the one that I use today because I had just fed it yesterday, so it's very active. If I use sourdough starter that has not been fed for a few days and it's a little bit less active, the dough doesn't raise quite as much. So it'll be interesting for you to see tomorrow how much it will raise. But in a traditional bread with yeast that I would make in this bowl, sometimes it literally fills the bowl. We generally don't see that with this sourdough type of bread. Also because of the fact that this is a bagel dough and it's just a much denser, so it doesn't have that kind of light and airy character to it. So we'll see what happens. And again, with the damp towel to cover it. And then like with the skyr, my go-to place for overnight is just in the microwave. That way it can raise and rest there for, 12 hours or so. Actually, a little bit longer than that. And then we'll check it in the morning, but at least there it's free from draft and it's about room temperature, which for where I'm at today, it's probably around 70 degrees, and that's just perfect for it. So we will check it in the morning and then move on to the boiling and baking stage, because it's not very much longer after that that we'll actually be having bagels that we can eat tomorrow morning. So I'll check with you then.
Time to make the donuts. Time to make the donuts.
Scratch that! It's time to make the bagels. Here's our dough. Voila! And you'll see, like I mentioned yesterday, it actually didn't rise very much. It's a pretty dense, stiff dough. It did rise a little bit, but not too much. I also have had it in the refrigerator for a little while this morning. I didn't get to it as early as I had planned because I had something else I had to do, namely eat sourdough waffles. So Seymour is the gift that keeps on giving. Now we're going to remove this from the bowl and use our little pastry cutter here to make 8 nice pieces. This recipe I have found for the size of bagel that we like to eat around here is a perfect 8 bagel recipe. I'll make those and we'll put them on some baking trays to let them rest for the first 15 minutes or so. The dough is cut into some pieces. Here's 4. You can tell they're just kind of somewhat uniform, but not exactly. Some pieces are a little smaller than the others. But I move them over here, shape them into balls, and put them on baking sheets that have been lined with parchment paper. Because we're going to do a boiling process and the bagels are put into the oven wet, then the parchment paper is a very important part of this because it keeps them from sticking. But so we have one rise that we need to do in this ball form. We'll put the moist towel back over them and let them sit for 15 minutes. 15 minutes have passed. The first rest is over in the ball form. Now we get to play with the dough like you're making a sculpture, because this is where you're going to shape it into the round with the hole in the middle that makes the bagel shape. It's very simple to do. Just treat this like you're playing with a lump of clay and push your thumb through the middle and begin to pull the dough until you get a good size hole in the middle. Now the dough is going to kind of retract a little bit on its own due to the gluten, and so you can pull it pretty far and it's going to kind of bring itself back in. You can also see there's some larger chunks here compared to what I have here. That's fine. This is generally, as you'll be able to feel, a spot where there's raisins in there, but you can really just mold it and play with it until you get it into the shape that you want it to be. Lay it back down on our tray on the parchment. Do the rest of these into the bagel shape, and then they'll rest for another 15 minutes before we go ahead and boil. Another 15 minutes have passed and the second rest is now finished. Remove our towel and you can see we have 8 nicely shaped bagels ready to go into the water to boil for a few seconds before we bake. We'll remove them over here to our bench next to the stove, and I have my pan here. You'll see that you might remember it's the same pan that I used to make my skyr. It has just plain tap water in it. I have also added a tablespoon of just plain organic honey to the tap water. The honey serves to add a little bit of sweetness to the bagels, and also it helps in the browning process while they are baking. So we'll remove the lid, move my waffles, and each bagel just takes 30 seconds on each side to boil. So put them down into the water, and I usually do 3 at a time just because that's how much kind of comfortable space I have in my pan. And then I set a timer real quickly here. Okay, 35 seconds, let's try that. And you'll see they begin to boil. They kind of just sit on the bottom. If after 10 seconds or so they don't start to float, then you can just kind of give them a gentle nudge. They might have slightly, attached themselves to the bottom. And sometimes they float pretty well, sometimes a little bit less so. I think sometimes it has to do with the number of raisins that are in there, kind of weighing them down. But anyway, they just boil again for about 30 seconds per side. So there's the first side, and you simply just reach in and flip them over. Set the timer for another 30 seconds. Let them finish. Now you can see them floating pretty well. And even though the water doesn't really continue with a rapid boil, but it's still hot enough to adequately boil them. And then once that process is finished, then we remove them to our pan. I kind of give them a little shake here, get some of the excess water off, then put them back on the pan so that they can next go into the baking process. Now again, this is where you can clearly see the fact that, these are very wet and they remain wet when I put them on the parchment paper, and so that's a good reason why we have the parchment paper, so that we can make sure that they don't stick too badly when they are baking. So next we'll finish boiling the rest of these bagels, and then we'll get them ready to put in the oven. Last 2 bagels finished boiling. Turn off my pan. retrieve them from the water. This is the point actually at which if you were making a plain bagel dough that you wanted to put something on top of it, like the seasonings in an everything bagel, or plain poppy seeds or plain sesame seeds or something, because the bagels are wet, then if you had a little tray or a little plate that had, for instance, the sesame seeds in it, this is the time that you would press the bagel onto those seeds so that you get a nice crust on the top, and then put the bagels in the oven. So here we have our oven that has been heated up to 425 degrees Fahrenheit. And again, I have a convection oven. I'm lucky in that regard, I guess. And so that means because of the action of the fan, I can actually bake 2 trays of bagels at a time. So if you don't have a convection oven, then I would suggest actually making just 1 tray at a time. And this is a process that's going to take, let's see, kitchen timer here, let's go 20 minutes. That's when we usually check them, after about 20 minutes or so, and a lot of times they're done then, but we'll see, because again, this is my new Mila range, and I think this is the second bagel recipe I've made in this, and so I'm going to check them at 20 and see what the heat is like. They may need up to 25 minutes, so you'll need to double check yours depending on your oven to see, but you'll be able to tell when they're done. They'll be nice and brown, and so we'll check back here in about 20 minutes and see what we've got. Time's up. Let's see what we've got. Oh boy, blast of steam. But those are looking good. Let's turn off our oven. Nice golden brown, raisins a little plumped up. Perfect. Remove those up to my stove top. And then all we simply do is remove them to the wire rack. And you can tell from what I just did there that they still even stick a tiny little bit. Again, that's because they were wet when we put them on the parchment. There we go. You can eat them fresh out of the oven like this, of course. And actually, even sometimes, even though they're fresh out of the oven and they're still warm, we take them like this and still cut them in half and then toast them a bit to make them even a little bit more like a crunchy toasted bagel. But they should be nice and crunchy on the outside and nice and soft on the inside. So there you have it. That is sourdough cinnamon raisin bagels. If you like what I've done here, please like and share and subscribe. And also, if you do venture into this recipe and you have questions or comments, please feel free to leave them in the comments section. Thanks, and we'll see you next time. Sjamst!